Hello everybody, thanks for watching this video. I'm Mohsen Rezazadeh. I hold a PhD in Applied Linguistics and currently I'm an assistant professor at the University of Isfahan. I designed a 9-session course on quantitative and qualitative research in applied linguistics. This is session 1 and in my lecture today I will be discussing quantitative research designs. According to Noonan 1992, there are two major research paradigms in applied linguistics, namely nomenological or analytic paradigm and exploratory or interpretive paradigm. In the first paradigm, the analytical or nomenological paradigm, the data are collected through an experiment and yields quantitative data which are subjective to statistical analysis, while the second paradigm, the exploratory or interpretive paradigm, utilizes a non-experimental method, yields qualitative data and provides an kind of interpretive analysis of the data in contrast to the analytical statistical analysis. In fact, we can say that one of the most general and best known distinctions in research methodology is between qualitative and quantitative research. These two classifications in educational research have been discussed widely. As the term quantitative suggests, the type of research mostly uses objective measures, including figures and numbers, to describe the social and educational phenomena, while in qualitative research, we are dealing with qualitative information in the form of, for example, verbal descriptions in order to interpret social and educational concepts. The distinction between qualitative and quantitative research signifies more than merely using figures versus non-quantitative data. Instead, the dichotomy refers to several things at the same time. This is clearly a complex issue, so let us start with a preliminary working definition for the two approaches. First, the definition for quantitative research. It involves data collection procedures that result in numerical data, which is then analyzed by statistical methods. A typical example can be this: a survey research using a questionnaire analyzed by statistical software like SPSS. In fact, quantitative research is obtrusive and controlled, is objective, is generalizable, and we can say outcome-oriented. On the other hand, qualitative research involves data collection procedures that result in open-ended, non-numerical data, which is then analyzed primarily by non-statistical methods. A typical example can be interview research, which is analyzed by qualitative content analysis. For example, first you code the data based on the transcriptions of the interview, and at the end you have a kind of discussion and conclusion. This is non-statistical method. In fact, talking about this binary distinction is not always fruitful. In fact, their principled combinations had led us to an emerging third research. which we call mixed methods research. Mixed methods research involves different combinations of qualitative and quantitative research, either at the data collection or at data analysis levels. A typical example can be consecutive and interrelated questionnaire and interview studies. That is, we in fact mixed both questionnaire results and interview results in one single study. In previous sessions, we discussed the need to state clear and answerable research questions and provide information on the construction of questions and the selection of variables. In this and the following sessions, we will deal with the design of the study. Today, the focus of this session is on quantitative research. In fact, quantitative research can be conceptually divided into two types, namely experimental and non-experimental research. In experimental research, researchers deliberately manipulate one or more variables, that is the independent variable, to determine the effect on another variable, which is the dependent one. This manipulation is usually described as a treatment, and the researcher's goal is to determine whether there is a causal relationship or not. Many types of experimental research involves a comparison of a pre-treatment and a post-treatment performance. On the other hand, we have non-experimental research. Again, it is a type of quantitative research, but here we are not manipulating or changing anything. We don't have any kind of treatment in our study. This is why we call it non-experimental. We usually do experiment when we want to determine the cause-effect relationship between the independent and dependent variables. This relationship is said to be specific because it refers to causality. One can claim that X is caused by Y when he or she can make sure that all the outside variables or outside factors are controlled by the design, in fact by a strong design. Indeed, the researcher attempts to investigate causality, which is a type of a specific relationship between variables in which one is regarded as cause and the other one is known as effect. Experimental designs follow the principles of scientific methods more rigorously than any other type of design. This is why mainly in science majors we can see that researchers used experimental designs, for example, in medicine, in chemistry, in biology, physics. They mainly use experimental designs because they want to find the cause or effect relationship between the variables. This is why we call these experimental designs as scientific methods too. Generally speaking, experimental designs enjoy the following features. First is random selection and random assignment of the participants. Random selection refers to a scientific procedure in which out of a well-defined population, a number of individuals are randomly selected, that is, they're selected by chance, in such a way that each member of the population has an equal chance or equal opportunity to be selected for the study. This is random selection. In contrast, random assignment refers to the process of randomly assigning the participants to different groups, for example, to the treatment group and non-treatment group, or experimental group and control group. This will also assure the internal validity of the research. Another feature is manipulation of the experimental variables. Here, by experimental variable, we mean the independent variable. In fact, the researcher controls or manipulates one or more independent variable and examines the effect of that on the dependent variable. Another thing is to control the extraneous variables. When we want to see the effect of one variable on the other one, we need to make sure that we don't have any other variables that in some way threats the results. That is, the effect which we find should only be related to the focus of the study. How can we do this? We need to control all of the extraneous variables. And the last one is the administration of a post-test. The post-test, as it indicates, is usually given to the participants after the experiment, and its purpose is to find out how much the treatment has been successful. Maybe we can compare the results of the post-test of the control group to that of the experimental group, or maybe we can compare the results of the pre-test and the post-test of the same group, that is, their performance before and after the treatment are compared. Experimental research falls into three broad categories, such as true experimental, quasi-experimental, and pre-experimental designs, each of which has its own features, but one point is worth mentioning here. You see, true experimental design has two key characteristics, such as manipulation and random assignment, as we just said in the previous slide. If the former is lacking, that is, if the manipulation is lacking, the study will be regarded as causal comparative, or we call it ex post facto design. But if the latter is missing, that is, if we don't have any kind of random assignment, then our research design will be quasi-experimental. We're going to deal with each of these categories one by one. True experimental design can be regarded as the most accurate and robust form of experimental research, in that they prove or falsify a hypothesis mathematically in light of statistical analysis. True experimental design is recognized as a type of between group design. Such designs, also called randomized designs, use randomization and provide maximum control of extraneous variables. Such designs, in fact, are characterized by a control group and an experimental group, and subjects are assigned randomly to either groups. In fact, true experimental designs have three basic characteristics. Random assignment of participants to different groups. B is the use of treatment, and C is the administration of the post-test. These three characteristics allow us to avoid almost all the problems associated with internal and external validity in true experimental designs. There are indeed many true experimental designs, but the two most common of them are a two-group post-test-only design and a two-group pretest and post-test design. We will discuss these two designs here. First, a two-group post-test-only design. In this design, subjects are assigned randomly to the experimental group and the control group. First, in the experimental group, we have the treatment. That is, the students in this group receive the treatment, while in the control group, students receive nothing, or they only receive the ordinary usual instruction. And in the final stage, post-tests are administered both for the experimental group and the control group. The existence of a control group here, similar to our experimental group, in all aspects except for receiving the treatment, helps us to test whether this difference would have occurred in the absence of the treatment. That is, we compare the two post-tests to see if they are different or not. The fact that, for example, the scores of the students on the post tests in the experimental group is higher than the scores of the students in the control group can show that this difference, this positive difference, is because of the treatment. The second type of experimental design is a two-group pretest and post-test design. First, we have two groups, experimental and control groups. Students are randomly assigned to the two groups. Then we have a pretest. A pretest is given both to the experimental group and the control group. Then we have the treatment in the experimental group, and after the treatment we have the post-test. In the control group we have again the pretest at the beginning, but we have no treatment, and at the end, just like the experimental group, we have the post-test. So both groups are given a post-test and also a pretest, and then the results are compared. In fact, the control group pretest post-test design is the strongest of all research designs and is the most preferred one in our field to monitor the effect of a new teaching method upon groups of learners. But a word of caution regarding the pretest post-test design should be made here. If the time between the pretest and the post-test is not considerable, for example, it should be at least 2 weeks, then you should seriously consider whether or not to give a pretest. See, if we have this time between the pretest and post-test, which is, for example, 7 days, then it's better not to even give a pretest because the students may remember the items in the pretest. This is the reason why the time should be more than 2 weeks between the pretest and the post-tests. If you remember, we said that experimental designs are of 3 types. True experimental design, quasi-experimental designs, and pre-experimental design. Here we want to talk about quasi-experimental designs. In fact, in most cases, researchers need to use intact groups to conduct an experiment. By intact group, I mean, for example, they need to consider one whole class as a group without randomly assigning students to each group. They consider, for example, class B19 as the control group and class B, for example, 20 as the experimental group. This is the meaning of intact class. So there is no random assignment or making artificial groups. We use groups in reality. Because of some limitations, researchers sometimes have to make use of quasi-experimental design. Sometimes you cannot randomly assign students to artificial groups, maybe because that institute does not let you to do that, or maybe because suppose you want to gather data in the university and you cannot assign the university students to two different groups because of the, for example, dean of the faculty or the administrators. They do not let you to do that. So sometimes because of these limitations, you have to use quasi-experimental designs. These designs are used, for instance, when intact classrooms are used as the experimental and the control groups. In fact, quasi-experimental studies take on many forms, but may be best defined as lacking the key components of a true experimental design. While a true experiment includes pre-test, post-test design, a treatment, and a control group, and also random assignment, a quasi-experimental design lack one or more of these design elements. Mostly in quasi-experimental design, we don't have random assignment of students to different classes. Thus, in some cases where it is not practical or possible to have complete control over the subjects, we used quasi-experimental designs. Quasi-experimental designs appear in two forms: time series design and non-equivalent groups design. Time series design. In fact, in time series design, we have several pretests and then the treatment, and afterwards again we have several post-tests. In a time series design, in order to compensate for the lack of the control group, the researcher has to have several pre-tests and several post-tests. A time series design consists of studying one group only over a period of time and has multiple pre-tests and multiple post-tests or observations by the researcher. For example, let's think that our topic is instruction and learning English articles, the effect of instruction on learning English articles, and we want to use time series design. First thing to say is that we only need one group of students. Okay, then we administer, for example, 4 pre-tests of English articles at the beginning of the course, maybe, for example, in the first 3 weeks of the program. And then the treatment is introduced, maybe for example, 5 sessions of article instruction. And then after the treatment is received by the students, finally, again, we administer 4 post-tests in 4 consecutive weeks at the end of the program. Then finally, for analysis, we compare the results of the 4 pre-tests with the 4 post-tests. As I said, the reason that we have several pretests and several post-tests is because we don't have a control group. So we need to compensate for the lack of the control group. And this is why we have time series design. In fact, this design is among one of the simplest design in second language research. Another version of the time series design is the equivalent time samples design. In this design, the treatment is introduced and reintroduced between every other pretest and posttest. Again, like in time series design, we have several pretests and posttests. But the difference is that here, after each pretest, like for example T1 in the diagram is pretest number 1, we have X, which means the treatment. And after this treatment, we have again test 2, which is the post-test. Again, in another session, first we have the pretest and we have the treatment, and afterwards we have the post-test. So that is after the first pretest and the treatment is introduced, followed by the post-test. And again, the second pretest following by treatment, and afterwards we have the second post-test, and this goes on and on to, for example, T7 and T8, as you can see at the end of the continuum in the diagram. So this procedure is followed for two or three times or four times, and then we compare the results by comparing the pretest and post-test at each of these stages. Think about the example I gave you for time series design. For example, the effect of instruction on learning English articles. Suppose that in each session, first we give students a pretest on English articles, then you start instructing the students on English articles, and at the end of the session, or maybe in the next session, you administer the post-test. Then for the other session, again, at the beginning you have the pretest, and then you have another type of instruction, and again at the end you have the post-test, and you repeat this maybe for 3 or 4 times, and at the end you compare the pretest and post-test in order to see the effect of the treatment. Next is non-equivalent groups post-test-only design. In this design, again, we have two groups, experimental group and the control group. And in this design, subjects are non-randomly distributed over the two groups. One group receives the treatment, that is the experimental group, and the other group receives, for example, nothing or does not receive the treatment, which is the control group. And at the end, again, we have the post-test for the two groups. It is just like the other design we talked about previously, but the fact is that here we assigned the students to the groups non-randomly. That is, maybe it is the case that we choose one class as the experimental group, and we choose another class as the control group. This is why we call it a quasi-experimental design, and we call it non-equivalent group design because there are two groups which are not equivalent. And we call it post-test only because we only have post-tests. We don't have any pretests. And because we don't have any pretests, there is a problem here. And the problem is that the initial or pre-existing differences cannot be controlled. So the obtained results are not due to the learner's exposure to the treatment. You cannot guarantee that the difference is because of the treatment, because we don't have any pretests. So the results might be considered as largely uninterpretable. So we need a better design in which we have the pretests. Another quasi-experimental design is non-equivalent groups pretest-posttest design. Again, here we have two groups, experimental group and control group, but not random. For example, we have two intact classes, and we say that one class is considered as the experimental group and the other class is considered as the control group. In fact, the difference between this design and the one mentioned in the previous slide is the test administered prior to the experiment, that is the pretest. The dependent variable here is measured both prior and after the treatment. This is the major difference between non-equivalent groups pretest-posttest design and non-equivalent groups posttest-only design. In fact, the dependent variable is measured both prior to and after the treatment. In this design, there is more confidence that the results are due to the treatment. Although such designs have the advantages of using real groups, and they might create some threats to the validity of the research. For example, lack of random assignment creates potential threats to the internal validity of research. Suppose that you have intact classes, and because you couldn't randomly select these students, and you consider all of the students in this class, it is obvious that you cannot control the factors like students' age, their, for example, gender, their previous knowledge, and things like that. Therefore, all of these can be considered as threats to the validity of research. But the point is that you have used, in fact, real groups, and this is the nature of quasi-experimental designs. And the positive point is that you have used real groups, and you have analyzed and investigated a topic in focus in real context, not in laboratory context. This is one, in fact, merit of quasi-experimental design. Okay, let's summarize what we just said in this session. First, we talked about the binary distinction between quantitative and qualitative research paradigms, and we said that we also have another type of research called mixed methods research. Then we talked about different quantitative design types, namely experimental and non-experimental designs. Today we talked about experimental designs, and we said that we have three types of experimental designs: true experimental, quasi-experimental, and pre-experimental designs. In this session, we only talked about true experimental designs or true randomized experimental designs and quasi-experimental designs. The true experimental design includes a two-group post-test design and a two-group pretest post-test design. Then we talked about quasi-experimental designs. In quasi-experimental designs, we introduced time series design, equivalent time samples design, non-equivalent grouped the post-test-only design, and finally non-equivalent groups pretest post-test design. These were the different types of quasi-experimental design. Next session we will talk about pre-experimental designs and non-experimental designs. I think this is the end of this session. Good luck.